Kia ora. Well, here's another interview for the Shift Aotearoa in VisionWeek in New Zealand in June 2020. And this morning I'm talking to Dr. Robbie Francis Watine about her vision for housing in Aotearoa going forward after this period of time where the world's been impacted by COVID-19. So I'm going to, without further ado, pass it over to Robbie to introduce herself and we'll take it from there. Morena, Robbie.
Morena, thanks Brennan. So as introduced, my name is Robbie and I am a senior disability rights researcher at the Donald Beasley Institute in Dunedin, and I'm also the co-founder and director of the Lucy Foundation, and we work with disability rights within the global coffee sector. So a few hats on, but with a great passion for ensuring the future of housing is accessible.
Awesome. Kia ora. And remind me later if we've got time to talk about Leilani Fahar's visit, which we were both a part of, which was heaps of fun.
Absolutely.
So Robbie, how's your experience of COVID been in the last few months?
Yeah, it's been an intense one actually. While a lot of the country was slowing down and taking a wee break from their everyday work lives, for us at the Donald Beasley Institute, our work ramped up, and part of what we were doing was supporting the Ministry of Health in their COVID-19 response specifically for the disability community. So, globally, we've seen that COVID-19 has had a real impact on both our older populations, but also disabled people as well, who sometimes have fragile health needs, support needs within the home, and these were all impacted by the lockdown, by the rahui. So a lot of what we've been doing has been responding to that in real time and ensuring that our community has been considered and responded to.
Right, so quite a significant impact on the disability community from COVID-19. Haven't really heard much about that in the news.
No, but I suspect more will be coming out, and there'll be a lot of evaluations because, under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Article 11 does talk about the government's responsibility to support the disability community through crises such as this one. So there will be a lot of learnings that come from this, I think, and a lot of preparing for the future if something like this comes along again.
Wow. So, Robbie, you're pushing all of the buttons this morning. So one of the other things in the back of my mind to catch up with you about, and we might as well just dive into it briefly though, is we've talked in the past about how you've been a part of it, but there's a certain thing going on in New Zealand at the moment around the rights of disabled people and some new innovative monitoring techniques for those rights. Can you remind me a little bit about those?
Yeah, so the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities it was established in 2006, and New Zealand played a really important role in creating that content for the convention itself. And New Zealand signed it in 2008, and from there came this responsibility that was articulated by Article 33, which kind of gives teeth to it. So often we have these human rights instruments that look good on paper and that countries sign up to, but do very little to actually implement them within their countries. But Article 33 obligates the New Zealand government to engage civil society in monitoring those rights. Something that the government signed up for when they signed the convention is what we call progressive realisation. So it's in recognition that you're not going to click your fingers and everyone has equal rights, that these things have to be progressively realised, but realised over time. So what we're working on is monitoring how people experience their rights. And this is sponsored by the DPO Coalition, the Disabled People's Organisation Coalition of New Zealand. And part of my work at DBI has been looking at, so the government will report to the United Nations to say, we're doing X, Y, and Z. But what we were interested in is looking at how do disabled people, how do the people on the ground experience these rights every day, and how can we inform the progressive realisation going forward? So it's quite it is really innovative, and I think that a lot of the other rights conventions that are in existence are looking to what we're doing with the Convention on the Rights with Persons with Disabilities and using it as a best practice standard.
Amazing. So listeners, I hope you're getting a sense for why I'm talking with Dr. Robbie Francis-Suatini this morning. Very insightful and knowledgeable, and this wasn't even supposed to be the kaupapa we were talking about this morning. So I think Robbie and I might need to catch up on that. But I'm just going to quickly reflect back on that particular issue, because just for clarity for listeners, really. So for those of you who aren't so familiar with it, human rights in New Zealand are pretty hard to grab hold of. They're pretty hard to get justice for. They're not enshrined in our legislation generally, especially social and economic rights, which is largely what we're talking about here. And because they're not in legislation, it's very difficult to hold the government to account for them. And I think the UN's learnt this over the years. And in one of their most recent instruments, which the name of which is what, sorry, Robbie?
The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities.
Thank you. They've actually created a mechanism where, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, where the government actually has a stipulated obligation to engage with relevant citizens in the monitoring of that instrument, which means, in short, people with disabilities in New Zealand need to be involved in the way the government manages the implementation of that instrument.
Yeah, that's
okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. So this is really exciting, because housing and the right to housing in New Zealand is exactly in the bucket of, boy, I'm not quite sure how to grab hold of that right. I know New Zealand has signed up to international instruments which create that right. But we're just not quite sure how to land it. And frankly, the Shift Aotearoa is doing some work on that, but we'll park that for another day. Thanks, Robbie, for introducing that subject so eloquently. So I'll just make a little plan for the rest of our interview, which is probably over time already. So I'd like to give you some time, and we'll talk about your vision for housing in Aotearoa. And then if we still feel like it, we'll have a quick chat about the February visit of Leilani Faha. So, Robbie, tell me, it's Vision Week. Great to talk with you. What's your vision for housing in the future in Aotearoa?
So all of my work and my vision, I guess, is based in a disability rights framework. So, housing rights are articulated in a range of human rights instruments. You've got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you've got the International Covenant on the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. But what the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities does is it takes it a step further. So not only are we talking about the right to adequate living conditions, and then housing comes from that, but which is it is stipulated in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in Article 28, but Article 19 takes this a step further, and it recognises the equal right of persons with disabilities to live in the community with choices equal to others. Now, this is a very, very difficult thing to measure and to implement, but this is something that the disability community in Aotearoa has been pushing for and really advocating, because if you look at the history of disability rights, or just disability in general in Aotearoa, we've had a history of institutionalization. So where people with disabilities were actively taken from their families, even if their family didn't want that, and put into mass institutionalization. And New Zealand has actually led the world in deinstitutionalizing, but we still have some pretty significant issues around access to the housing market, choice and control. A key focus of Article 19 is the right to choose your place of residence, your right to access your community to prevent isolation and segregation, and also other mainstream based services and facilities in an accessible way. So this is kind of the foundation of the vision that I have for Aotearoa. If I was to break it down really simply, I think there are two key aspects that we need to look at when it comes to disabled people's right to adequate standard of living and housing. We've got the public housing sector and we've got the private housing sector. So if we start with public, Housing New Zealand, now Kāinga Ora, when Kāinga Ora came in last year, they have an accessibility plan, which was wonderful. We celebrated that, which said that they're going to ensure 15% of their new builds are going to be built to universal design standards. So universal design, just for a quick definition, means the design of products, environments, programs, services that can be used by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation. So we're not just talking about accessibility for disabled people, but we're talking about accessibility for our aging population as well, for anyone who wants to easily use an environment, including housing. So this is about making it usable from the outset rather than have to retrofit for accessibility in the future. Mm. Now, it's believed, and this is quoted from Paula Tesoriero, the Disability Rights Commissioner, that only 2% of our housing stock in Aotearoa is accessible, even though 1 in 6 people require adaptations or modifications to be able to live safely within the home. I mean, the disability population in New Zealand is 24%. A quarter of our population self-identifies as living with disability, yet only 2% of our housing stock is accessible. And what we're seeing is new builds, even government initiatives, building homes that still have the toilet upstairs. So for me, as a disabled person myself, I can use stairs, but with difficulty. So if I have to move into this space, that is going to be something that takes away my energy and my safety that, you know, I could be using on other stuff. But it also means that my elderly grandmother can't visit me for an extended period of time because she might need to use the toilet and she can't get up the stairs. Or my friend who's a wheelchair user can't come to my house to celebrate my birthday. So it extends far beyond just the structure, the 4 walls. This is about community and about social interaction as well. So I would like to see Kāinga Ora houses, all of them, not just 15% of the new builds. I would like to see all of them built to universal design standards. Now, if we're looking at the private sector, we're still facing these same issues. So if I'm a renter and I need an accessibility feature within the home, there is very limited funding around that. So I might say, okay, well, I'll pay for it. I'll pay for a wet shower bathroom, which means that it's step-free and safe for me. But the landlord can say no. And the reason this is because the building code, which is, the building code, which is contained within the Building Act, it doesn't require private residential developments to be designed in a way that's accessible. So if we're talking about private, my vision would be an updating of the Building Act so that there is more incentive to be building accessible homes from the outset, so that this, you know, the largest minority in New Zealand, the disability population, can have access to safe and adequate housing. I mean, we're not just talking about preference and luxury here. We're talking about real safety issues that actually can cause further disability and further psychosocial disabilities, mental health issues. You know, the outcomes are just they're so prevalent amongst the community, and it all comes back to access to adequate and safe housing. So if I could divide it, I think those are the 2 areas I would work on. And my vision is that all disabled New Zealanders have access to an adequate standard of living with choice and control, access to their community, and safety within their home.
Stunning. Robbie, thank you for that. And I'm just going to challenge you because I'm going to turn it into a soundbite. So just tell me in a couple of sentences, what's your vision for public housing?
My vision for public housing is that all Kāinga Ora homes are built with universal design in mind, not just some, all of them. And this will speak to not just the disability population, but an aging population, homes that are culturally responsive, that are co-designed by the people who need them most.
Awesome, amazing. And what's your vision for the private sector?
My vision for the private sector is that the building code is updated to incentivize residential developers to think of universal design and to implement universal design from the outset rather than retrofitting, and for disabled people to have stronger rights implementations as renters. Yeah.
Extraordinary. Kia ora, Robbie. Hey, I'm interested to just talk about this issue of choice a little bit, because you mentioned that it sits pretty powerfully within the you're going to say the name again, the Declaration.
Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities.
Thank you. I'm sorry. The wording's important. So it sits within there, and so I sort of think about my own life, and I think about the choices that are easy, I guess, which are things like, do I need to think very hard about this, whether my kids can go to the school down the road? I guess because neither of my children have a disability, I don't actually need to think about that all that carefully. I don't need to go and examine the grounds and think about accessibility issues. And I guess things like, of course, the house that I choose to live in with my family, or that we choose to live in as a family, I should say, we don't have to think about. So that means that I can literally choose any house on the market, right? Without needing to put this really critical lens on it. And then I also think about a friend of ours who's looking for a new house at the moment, and one of them that she's looking at just happens to be right next to a well-serviced bus stop, and it just makes the house look so much more inviting, because we're all trying to move that way. But I can imagine that for someone with a disability, you would also see that bus stop outside the front of the house and think, wow, I really want to live at that house. But then you go to the house and it's got 5 steps leading up to the front door. As you kind of said, it's got the bathroom on the first floor, up a flight of stairs. Maybe it's got narrow doorways and things like that. So are those those are some basic choices that we make around housing, right?
Yeah. And they're choices that everyone faces, regardless of living with a disability or not. But when the only 2% of the housing stock is said to be accessible, your choices suddenly go from this all the way down to this. And so you're having to choose based on accessibility rather than proximity to your workplace or proximity to the school that the zone of the school that your children go to. When we think about things like access for children who have been denied access to their local school because they have a disability, they're having to travel an hour across town to go to a school that has accepted them because it's accessible, or for children with learning disabilities. These are the kinds of the stresses and pressures that the disability community is under, and it's exhausting. It's exhausting, and it affects your ability to be able to work, to parent, to attend health, medical appointments, all of these things, because the choice and control you have over where and how you can live is so limited. So, in that sense, we have a long way to go until disabled people's housing rights are realised. And it is really problematic because, disabled people have the highest unemployment rates. We have less access to adequate education than the rest of the population. We have lower health outcomes. So when you add all of these things on top of it, housing is the kind of the center of these interlinking issues, and we're not looking after the people who need safe housing. And then we bring in intersectionality with that. So, ethnicity, gender, looking at sexuality, all of these other things are creating and maintaining, I would say in many cases, the poverty of people with disabilities. It's it's like was said, like Leilani said, we're not dealing with a housing crisis, we're dealing with a human rights crisis.
And interestingly, one of the notes that I've written down relating to Leilani, so Robbie's referring to Leilani Faha, who was the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing, UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing, who visited New Zealand in February, and Robbie and I were lucky enough to spend some time with her. But one of the key issues I think that came out of that, which we should absolutely explore more, is the intersectionality of human rights themselves. So the way that the disabilities instrument or disabilities rights interact with housing rights, interact with Indigenous rights, interact with other economic, social rights, and civil and political rights is something that the UN's also, they're not grappling with it. They're very clear. These rights exist together. They don't exist in a vacuum, in silos. And so, but I want to park that because it's something we should talk about again another time. But thanks for highlighting that. So I guess one other thing that I wanted to talk about, because I want to repackage a little bit of what you've said and put a proposition to you, and see what your response would be. So basically, listeners, what I want to be really clear about is Robbie's actually making a really sensible argument for a public good outcome for New Zealand, which is 100% of our public housing being built by the government being accessible for not just for people who experience one particular kind of disability or another particular kind of disability, because the discourse now is that we have this thing called universal design, which basically makes the house as good as it can possibly be for the widest possible section of our society. Is that a fair summation? So my proposition really is this is just sensible, isn't it? Because won't it cost much more to retrofit this kind of accessibility than just doing it when we're building the houses?
100%. Like it's just total common sense, and I don't know why it hasn't. I mean, because we've been campaigning for it, and I stand on the shoulders of giants who've been campaigning for it for a long time before me. These aren't new ideas, but I think it's LifeMark, which is an organisation here in New Zealand who looks at accessible design and universal design standards, and they estimated that it costs no extra money to implement 90% of their accessible design standards. It's not more expensive to build an accessible house, okay? It doesn't cost anyone, the developer, more money. Yet what we'll see is that, for example, in some of these building schemes, they charge variation fees. So we've got the blueprint, we're going to build this house, you pay for the house, but if you want anything changed, it'll cost you this variation fee. So okay, that might be expected, but when you're talking about safety design and universal design standards, you're still having to pay extra. So for me, as a disabled person, I have to pay extra to have a house I can use and be safe in, when the person next to me who doesn't have a disability gets the standard non-accessible house, and as my neighbour, I still can't visit them. So it's ridiculous, really. It doesn't cost more to be accessible. If you do it from the outset, you're co-designing with people with lived experience. It is a better outcome for all people, and that's the key to universal design. It's a better outcome for I don't know, the musician who has a really heavy amplifier, or the cello player who has to lug their cello inside because it's huge, or the person who's pushing a parent who's pushing a pram doesn't have to go up a flight of stairs, or can access the child's bedroom quickly and safely in the night when they have a nightmare. You know, all of these things make sense to such a wide variety of people. Don't cost any extra, and yet we still can't get it into our thinking that this is what we need to be doing. So it needs to happen from the beginning. Retrofitting is not a solution. It's not a framework I'm interested in thinking about. Great for those that can afford to do it and who will do it, but we need to be thinking about from the outset, for sure.
Amazing. And so tell me, just as devil's advocate, no, I shouldn't say that. Just tell me what your view on this is. What would the negative impacts be if we did universal design 100%?
I don't see any. I think that universal design is about harmonizing our human rights obligations within the housing sector of Aotearoa. You know, all of it fits into te tiriti, it fits into our human rights obligations. This is all about the people who live in the homes, not about the people at the top. This is about usability, about responding to the needs of our specific population.
Awesome. Wow. Amazing, amazing insights, Robbie. There was another question in my mind. I can't quite remember what it was, but I do just want to reflect, because there was something you just said quickly and I wanted to pull it out and just say it again, because one of the examples Robbie's raised is as her own example. If she moved into a new development, and she may be lucky enough to get one of the 15%, or she may be lucky enough to get a universal a house that's been designed by universal design principles. But if her neighbour hasn't got an accessible house, then that compromises Robbie's ability to just go next door and visit, which is a real. I was going to say it's a conundrum. It's not really a conundrum, because the answer is too simple for it to be a conundrum. All houses should just be universally designed. So, look, a final question, and then we'll wrap this up. And I think we're going to have to chat again on some other subjects. But do you have any insight or knowledge into the regulatory status of universal design? Is it something that's being used by any councils in particular, or by government, in fact?
Yeah, I mean, it is starting to be talked about more, for sure. I mean, even the fact that Kāinga Ora has it in their accessibility plan is definitely something to celebrate and to acknowledge that that's a step that has been taken. Last year there was movements to talk to, or there was campaigning around having universal design acknowledged in the building code, and when that was under discussion, but that wasn't implemented. But we do see councils in particular working towards this, and there is, people do understand the sensibility of it, but when it comes to the developer, or we're so stuck in our ways. So I think we have pockets of good things going on, and I also I can't recall exactly, but there was an article only a couple of weeks ago that talked about, it must have been a chip who was building accessible homes, I think down South Island somewhere, and which is amazing, and that is going to benefit so many people. But the question around that is, I think it was they might have been a charity. Why is it that it's falling on the charities or the non-governmental community housing providers to carry this responsibility, when actually it's the New Zealand government who signed the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities? So it actually directly applies to them. They have a responsibility and obligation to fulfill these rights. So we have to be careful about how it's a good thing to do, but that we don't slip into the charitable model of housing, like we're doing this because I feel sorry for you, because you're a poor disabled person and I'm going to help you. We have to get into the mindset of, no, we are humans with human rights, and the government has signed on to this, and I have a right to an adequate standard of living, and the government is responsible for implementing that right. So there's a bit of a balance there, which I would like to see. I would like to see more of in the future, of the government taking up and implementing the human rights that they've signed on for.
Amazing. And so thank you so much, Robbie. He mihi nui ki a koe. I just want to I'll just quickly make a statement about progressive realization, because I think it's something that's a little bit missing in the conversation. So there's a realization in the world now that human rights, when a nation signs an international instrument, it just doesn't become binding immediately. And even when the government puts legislation in place about a particular thing, it doesn't change people's living circumstances overnight. There needs to be a progressive realization, and so that's what we're kind of talking about, and it is a doctrine in international law. So we're talking about the idea that we can't do this, we still can't do this in 2 months, but if we're looking at a 10 or 20 year vision, we need to be getting agreement around the table that it is possible to put these things into place, and that's what we should be aiming for. Is that a fair summation?
Absolutely, and I know you and I and Leilani have spoken at great length about the importance of strategy, and having that come from a rights-based framework, not just something that's made up by I don't know, people who already own homes who have well-paid jobs, but it's rooted in rights. So, looking forward to further discussions around that and having input from the communities who are most affected by this conversation.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Kia ora, Robbie. I'll wrap up our little recording here, and you can either jump offline or you can stay for a debrief. It's up to you, but I'll just do a quick plug for VisionWeek, which is happening this week in Aotearoa. I work for the Shift Aotearoa. I'm Brennan Rigby. I'm the project lead, trying to run some content for VisionWeek, which is setting a future vision for New Zealand. And you can reach us at theshiftaotearoa.wordpress.com or on Twitter at Shift Aotearoa. So kia ora, Robbie, Dr. Robbie Francis Watene. Really appreciate your time this morning and look forward to talking to you again.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
Cheers.